Well, for those of you that weren't able to make class the other day, this is our little lecture here on the Reformation and Counter Reformation to give you some background on what we're going to be looking at over the next few days. So, this is a movement that builds out of the Renaissance, just to give you a little bit of a background. So, it's right off there, and it's going to focus on religions in Europe, so mainly or solely on Christianity and how the Bible and should be interpreted and what should be believed as a proper Christian. So to begin with, we got some keywords that you should know and be aware of so that you know what I'm talking about when when I'm discussing things here in the Reformation. So things like clergy, clergy are church officials, things like corruption, which is just being dishonest and using your position for power, celibacy, which is the idea of that you shouldn't have sex. This is going to apply to priests during this time in the Catholic Church. Excommunication, which means you get kicked out of heaven. This is usually done by the Pope. The practice of indulgences, which is this idea that a slip of paper can be sold to by the church to forgive you for your sins, and that is usually done by the Pope as well. And the Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church. The idea of protesting, or what protest is, which is an action of expressing disapproval. The idea of reform, which is to make things better, usually getting rid of corrupt practices or making something more, just making things better in a way that will improve the situation, which I guess that's very redundant, sorry for that. And then simony, which is the buying of church offices or positions or benefits or anything like the like there. So those are the basics of words you should know so that you're understanding what we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes, or over the next several minutes. But if you need to take more time to get these definitions down, make sure you pause the video here and then move on when you got it all down. So just to begin with here, if we look at Europe at this time, religiously, Western Europe, which is where we're going to be focusing, is pretty much all Catholic. You might have a few minority groups in there. Some Eastern Orthodox Church would be in some of these areas as merchants, but the majority of the population throughout Western Europe, there in Germany, Italy, France, or the Franks in England and stuff like that, is going to be Catholic. And so that means they're all united. But if we look at a map, and now this is a little bit earlier than the 1500s when we're starting this Reformation, but giving you a rough idea, you can see the map on the bottom right here. There's a lot of divisions, a lot of different kingdoms. You got England, you got France, you got the Holy Roman Empire, you got the Papal States. Those are states controlled in Italy by the Pope. You have the Kingdom of Naples, you have Castile and Aragon, which will eventually become the Kingdom of Spain. So all these divisions, but the church is one uniting factor. Now, this is good that the church can unite all these people and maybe lessen some of the conflicts, but that doesn't stop conflicts from happening. And if you wanted to make a prediction of what you're going to see happening when the Europeans get divided by religion, you're going to see it's going to be a lot of regional places based on these kingdoms where you're seeing things happening, and you can bet that it's going to lead to more conflicts in Europe here. So why does the Reformation happen? Well, there are many causes of it. We're going to just try to glance over a few of them here. But the first one is church corruption. So there are many things that people were pointing out about the church that were making them hypocrites of what they actually believed and said should happen, but they didn't actually follow themselves. So one of the biggest ones is the idea of priests being celibate. Now, this was a regulation put in place about 1,000 years before this or so, maybe a little bit less than that, but it had been in place for hundreds of years that priests should be celibate in the Catholic Church. And they're supposed to be, and monks and any other religious lay people, except for a few exceptions. And there's a problem with that in that they're not following that. There are accounts of them going to brothels, whether it's a priest or a monk or even the Pope himself. The Pope himself has kids, which shows that you are not following this idea of celibacy, and they're supposed to be the head of the church, the top guy. But if you went to the Vatican, which is where the Pope is headed out of in Rome, and you go to his palace in the Vatican, you would see there are rooms dedicated to his children so that they can live somewhere. That's problematic, and people look at this hypocrisy and say something's wrong here. Then there's the practice of simony, which is you had officials buying offices or buying up ranks in offices or buying special benefits or rights with their positions. And so at times with this, you get people being unqualified taking over places and people being way too young to have those positions. So there are some people that will pay the Pope to have their son become a priest, even though they're not qualified to be it. Or people will pay to get a bishopric and become a bishop of a region so they can have a nice fat salary. And then they won't even live in that region. So people go, this is not right, especially when it goes to the extremes of you got like 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds being placed in leadership positions in the church because their family have bought offices to get in there. And now you got a kid that's about your age running things. And that might sound great to you as a 16-year-old. I hope it sounds actually it makes you a little bit nervous if something like that happened. But I just want you to think if one of your peers was running the school here with that. And that's a very small scale situation there. Now think of them running and being something more like a governor or the leader of a whole county. A little bit maybe scarier that you got someone that's that inexperienced doing that stuff. And then building off that unqualified bit, they don't really train the people. There are untrained priests in different areas that can't perform the rites. And when we're talking about a highly religious people at this time, if you're not performing the rites and rituals right, you are not going to be able to forgive people for their sins and do all that's expected of you. And so therefore, those people aren't going to get to heaven. And that causes a lot of stress for people. And then the last big thing here within this church corruption bit is there's a schism within the Western Church of having three popes at once. There was a pope in France, there was a pope in Rome, and then there was a pope in, I can't remember the other city, in Italy though. But you can see on the map there you got two popes. It's a little bit closer to northern Italy there. I can't remember the region that he was in. But you have three popes at once. There's only supposed to be one pope that's the head of the church. And now you got three people arguing that they are the true pope and that the other one's wrong, and they're saying all these mean and nasty things, and that gets people going, well, maybe like none of these guys should be leading because they're all not really doing what's expected of someone being in the highest office of the church. And so this all puts chinks in the Catholic Church facade and gets people kind of thinking, maybe things aren't going so well. We need to change things up. Then this actually continues on with the corruption here, but then there's a practice called indulgences, which is good in nature or good in idea that you can, if you're worried about your sins and stuff like that, to alleviate your stress of sins, you could pay an indulgence to be forgiven for your sins. And so the church goes about collecting money from people, and in return they get a slip of paper that says they've been forgiven for their sins. Or one of their family members that's in purgatory or in hell can be released from there. And usually it didn't go as extreme as hell. It went more with purgatory, so you had to spend less time there. If you don't know what purgatory is a place between heaven and hell. So you have heaven, where you go if you are unblemished and don't have any sins. Purgatory, you go to wait if you have just minor sins or a lot of minor sins or something like that. And depending on how sinful you were, depends on how long you'll spend in purgatory. And then you have hell, which is where you've been pushed away because you did things that were so terrible. So these indulgences are a way for people to get out of that purgatory part and get into paradise right after, instead of spending 100 years, thousands of years, or whatever in purgatory with whatever that might look like. Now, there's a major issue with this, and that doing this occasionally might not have upset people, but doing this as a constant thing, going around constantly money grubbing from people, sending essentially a used car salesman like Johann Tetzel going around selling and making all these claims about what it does without any real proof that does anything, that causes problems. And the money being raised by the church for that, in Italy, it's going to go to Italian churches, which is great, and that's what you want to see it being used for. But in Germany, in France, and other regions of Europe, that money, again, is not staying in that region. It's going back to Italy to help build their churches. The most famous of these is St. Peter's Basilica, which is the major cathedral that is where the Pope preaches from. And a lot of this money is going to that. And that really upsets people. Like if you are donating to a cause and you're expecting it to go to something local, but then it goes somewhere far away that you can't even fathom where it's at and you're never going to visit there, that's problematic. So you'll see people complaining about that. And this kind of sets the stage for things within the church. But there's one more cause that leads or makes this Reformation movement possible, and that's actually a new technology that comes out called the printing press. I probably cannot understate how important the printing press has been to human history. In 1440, when it's invented by Johann Gutenberg, it's actually a modified version. He improves upon the printing press. It had been around before then, but what he does makes it so that printing can become a much improved technology, and it can be a way to get a message out to the masses. Because printing before was you had to carve everything into wood, and then you'd put ink on that wood, and then you'd press it down on paper, and you'd get that on there. Now, if you wanted to create a whole page or a whole book through that process, you'd have to create a whole wood block for each page of that book, and that's not realistic. And so what he does is he creates this movable type. So he creates metal letters that then are of equal size and shape roughly, and puts them across in a row, and then with that they can be organized to say whatever words you want them to say. And because you have millions of the little letters, or maybe not millions but thousands of the little letters, you can put a whole page in there, and when you get done printing that page, you just take them out of your set that you have and you put in the next page. So this allows a much quicker copying of books, because before then you didn't do the wood block printing because that wouldn't have been effective unless you were just doing a sheet of paper or something like that. And what you did do is you had monks, or you had other people that were hired to just copy books by hand. So they would go and copy a page by page by page. So this is much faster. It's also going to be a lot cheaper because you can do 100, 1,000, however many books that you want at a time, and then you can sell them for cheaper because you're going to make those 1,000 books in the time that it takes one monk to transcribe or to rewrite a whole book in a new book, and maybe even more than that. So you have the capabilities to get a wide message, and it also makes profitable things like pamphlets, which are smaller books, and it makes possible things like broadsides like you see here. Those broadsides allow you to then send a message out that can be read to everyone real quickly and succinctly. So this allows information to spread, and it's very similar to like the internet that we have today. If you post something, anyone in the world can see it. Now, it wasn't instant like it is today with the internet, but it's very similar to that in that you have a disruptive technology changing how we get our information, and it leads to issues in the misuse and abuse of it, just again like you see today. There was fake news back then. There's always been fake news, and so you'll get reports that get flown around here at this time from this that will cause major issues and will be complete lies or propaganda type things, but people will believe it because they can now hear it. And also because books and everything like that are cheaper, and because they're going to be more available to people, more people are going to be able to read, or more people are going to try to get an education so that they can read. And so we're going to see education go up, or literacy go up, which is going to help improve the whole mass of the population's level of understanding of things. And then last thing with this is the oppressed people, or the people that are calling for change, are going to be the ones that adopt this technology faster. The Catholic Church is going to resist this, but because they resist using it, they prevent getting out a major message to stop these reformers from doing things until it's too late. And then, again, it's already too late. The Reformation has already happened, or already taken hold. So, some early reformers. These guys tried to reform things, tried to critique the church and get them to fix their ways, but the church did not want to do that. And so you have John Wycliffe. He's in England. He questions the authority of the Pope. You have John Huss, who criticizes the wealth of the church. And you have Erasmus, who attacks church corruption. These three guys lay the foundation for our later reformers. They're going to bring all this stuff together. And they went on much more things than this, but just to give you an idea, like the foundation of where things are coming from here, this is what's going on, or this is what's leading up to a guy that we're going to see next here called Martin Luther. This guy that comes up, Martin Luther, sets the whole thing in motion in the early 1500s. He is from Germany. He was a monk and a professor at Wittenberg University, and in seeing the indulgences and people like Johann Tetzel going around and selling these to people unscrupulously, selling them kind of falsely about what they actually all do, he created a list of 95 theses. If you want to see a movie clip from the movie Luther about him posting it and then the reaction to that and how it gets spread out quickly, take a look at the link there on your own time. But he posts them on a church door because that was like the bulletin board of the day, and saying a bulletin board of the day is dating myself to like when bulletin boards actually had information on them, but it'd be just like posting it to a blog post or something like that on Facebook or I just dated myself again. I don't know if Snapchat does that stuff, but whatever, a tweet on Twitter to have a conversation about indulgences and reforming the practice. Well, the posting of his 95 Theses snowballs way out of his control, because what happens is common people, common printers go and take it from the door, make hundreds or thousands of copies of it, and send it throughout Germany, spelling out what Martin Luther is thinking here. Now, again, this was supposed to start a debate, but when this spirals out of control, it leads to people going, yeah, Martin Luther's right. We need to get rid of this indulgences practice and all these other problems that the church is doing. And so this unites a lot of northern German people to stand up against the church. And the church doesn't like this, so the church fights back. So it excommunicates Martin Luther eventually, which then he goes, okay, gloves are off. We're going toe-to-toe now. We're going to fight. And so he starts creating a new church, and eventually his ideas will become something we call the Lutheran Church, which is still around today. It's one of the larger Protestant sects in Christianity, or denominations in Christianity. And some of the major things that he preaches within his new church that he creates is, one, salvation does not come through works or come through buying indulgences. It comes through your faith, and your faith in God alone, because God gives forgiveness for things. He also translated the Bible into German, which sounds like, well, why is that a big deal? Shouldn't they have added it in German already? And they didn't. Actually, going back to our previous slide, John Wycliffe was one of the first guys to translate the Bible outside of Latin, which is what the Latin or Greek, I should say, which is what the common practice of having the Bible in was. So the majority of people, even if they could read their own language, could not read the Bible, and that was problematic. So people don't know what's being said, so they just have to accept what the church is saying the Bible says and what you should do if you're a good Christian. So he translates that, and that's going to lead to more people needing an education, because he thinks people need to be able to read and interpret the Bible on their own and not necessarily trust the powers that be. So there's some of that skepticism idea that we have from the Renaissance coming in here, and a little bit of individualism with that. And then he also argues that priests should be allowed to marry. There's nothing in the Bible saying priests or people within the church shouldn't be able to marry, and so he argues for that, and he will eventually get married to a nun who will also leave the church. And the church being the Catholic Church, they set up the Lutheran Church. And the only reason why he survives, or this movement survives, is because he gets supported by the princes. And the princes really like his ideas. One, because they get themselves out of the yoke, or out from under the thumb of the Pope. But also, one thing Luther calls for is the confiscation of church lands, or the taking back of church lands from the church, and to distribute them. Now, you might hope that they would be distributed to the people, the common people, because they're like the ones that could use the land. But Martin Luther argues, because the Pope or the princes are helping him and stuff, and that's what they want is the land. And so he argues that they should be taking the land. The princes should get the land, or it should go to who can buy them. And the people that are going to be able to buy them are the princes. And then they might go and sell them, but then they're going to make a profit off that. So it's all to benefit the princes. So there's an economic reason why this divide happens. It's not all spiritual, but there are some huge spiritual elements in things. But some people will join on for economic reasons or political reasons. So that's Martin Luther in a nutshell. There's a lot more you can go into there. I know some of you guys in your German classes are talking about, or have talked about, Martin Luther, so you guys have a background in there. But he's not the only reformer. There's another guy named John Calvin. He's in Switzerland. And he comes up with some new ideas as well, building off of Martin Luther's ideas. He actually takes over for a guy with a much cooler name called Ulrich Zwingli, who died in a battle defending Switzerland's right to think about their faith on their own and to break away from the Catholic Church. And so he comes in, he's brought in by the Swiss people, and he creates some new doctrines or some new ideas in the faith. The biggest one being that he's remembered for, and that you should probably know from this, is the idea of predestination, which means everything's been predetermined. God already knows exactly what you've done in your life, what steps you're going to take, when you're going to take them, what actions you're going to do, and he's already determined whether you're going to heaven or hell. You don't know whether that's happening or not, but God knows, because God's all-knowing and it's already been planned. And so it kind of takes away the idea that you have freedom of choice in your life and what you're doing. And so this is a very controversial topic still in the church. You can argue many different ways on this, and there are some people that you can take the predestination many different ways of everything's already determined and you're already lockstepped in with what's going on, or you can look at it like God already knows because he's all-knowing, or she's all-knowing, or it's all-knowing, and it already knows that you're going to take these pathways and stuff like that. So it's really confusing. We're not going to get into the whole theology of it. I probably can't explain it very well to fully explain it and to make it so that it makes a whole lot of sense. But just realize that it's arguing that there isn't necessarily a lot of free choice that you have in your life, and things have already been chosen by God of what's going to happen to you. And then with his ideas, that'll establish the Presbyterian Church in Switzerland, and it's also going to set up the Anabaptist churches, which will set up in the Netherlands especially, but also in France. And those will lead to spreading into England, and in England they're going to become the Puritans, and the Puritans are going to make their way over to the Americas, and there's going to be a connection there with the Americas, and that they're going to have these similar ideas of predestination and stuff like that. And they're looking to escape persecution in England. Which, speaking about England, there's a nice transition there to our last major reformer. Although it could be argued he's not really reforming things a lot, but he does create a new church. So Henry VIII is the King of England, and he actually used to be, or was, a major protector of the church, especially when Martin Luther first came out. He spoke out against Martin Luther, said Martin Luther was terrible and that this was wrong, and he defended the church. But then he really wanted to have a boy, and with his first wife, Queen, I can't remember her name, sorry, but with his queen, he couldn't have a boy, and so he's like, well, she's getting old, she can't have kids anymore, I need a new wife. And so he wants a divorce. But you can't divorce in the Catholic Church, you have to get an annulment. And the Pope, being that he had close ties with the Queen's nephew, and the nephew was very powerful, the King of France, he went, nope, can't do the annulment. And so Henry VIII goes, well, okay, fine. If you're not going to do the annulment, I'm going to make my own church then, like other people are doing. And so he makes his own church so that he can divorce. So he gets rid of that wife, marries a new person, Anne Boleyn. They have kids, but not any boys. And so then he divorces her. But on top of divorcing her, he also cuts off her head for treason and stuff like that. And then he gets married another handful of times, and each time getting a divorce after, and in none of the marriages does he get a boy. The only boy that he has that actually makes it to out of childhood for a little while is one out of wedlock. That one will become king, but he'll die shortly into his reign, so then his daughter from his first marriage, Mary, will take over, and she doesn't like how her dad treated her mother, so she brings England back to Catholicism. And then she dies after really doing some mean persecutions to people that are Protestants, going about killing them, and so that's why she's got the nickname Bloody Mary there. And her sister, her half-sister, takes over, Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and she brings Anglicanism back because with what Henry did, it really helps her out as monarch of England, which is it puts the monarch, the king or the queen of England, at the head of the English church. And so that gives you power, and that gives you control of the church lands, which is something that they needed to kind of raise money and funds. And so this Anglican church will become the main church in England, and it'll get shifted over to the Americas as well. And if you go to a Episcopalian church here in the United States, you would be going to an Anglican church. But we kind of break away, our Episcopalian churches break away from the Anglican church after the American Revolution. They don't necessarily be linked together, but they have the same ideas and practices, which actually aren't very different from the Catholics. It's really the big thing that Henry VIII wanted was just so that he could break away and have a divorce. A lot of the things, a lot of the practices are pretty darn similar to the Catholic Church with what they do. Okay, so after the Reformation, this is what Europe looks like. It's a nice map showing you where the different ideas and branches break off. So you got Anglicanism in England here. You've got Calvinism in Scotland. I guess I should have brought that up on the Calvin side there. You got Calvinism in France here. You've got it up here in the Netherlands. You can see the Calvinism in Switzerland. And then in the Holy Roman Empire, which this is Germany here, you see all that orange, that's the Lutheran Church, and it goes up into Scandinavia and into the eastern Baltic by the Teutonic Knights. This is all going to set up a lot of conflicts here. It's not supposed to, or the goal of religion isn't to have these conflicts, but because of this divisions now, and you got rival powers anyways, it's going to cause fights. And so the first of the major conflicts is going to be within France with the Huguenots. These are those Calvinist groups within France that are not Catholic anymore, and there's going to be 8 civil wars over the course of a couple hundred years. It's going to lead to a lot of death. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Huguenots will die in the fighting through massacres and things like that. Eventually, that fighting will be ended by the Edict of Nantes. It's not Nantes or Nantes or anything like that because it's French, so it's the Edict of Nantes, and that allows the Protestants to practice freely, although this will be revoked later on by a guy named Louis XIV, and he will begin the persecution again of those Huguenots. Then the bigger conflict is the 30 Years' War. That's going to happen with a fight between the German princes in the north that are Lutheran with the Holy Roman princes and the Holy Roman Emperor and the Papal States going and fighting the Lutherans to get rid of them in Germany and force them to come back to Catholicism. Well, they're not going to, neither side really wins, but the Protestants will win and win assurances that they can determine their own faith for their people. So the prince of whatever kingdom or duchy or whatever that is that he has can determine what his people in his area need to follow. That doesn't mean that you get to decide as a subject in there. If you want to be Catholic but you're with a prince that's Protestant, you're going to need to become that Protestant faith or move out of that area, which sometimes you can't do back then. So it causes problems, but it solves some of the issues of it. It also gives a lot of power to some of the people that fight in concessions, in that like Sweden will become a major power and they'll gain parts of Germany from this. France will gain parts of Germany, which actually, if you're thinking about things, I just talked about France being Catholic mainly, but they're fighting with the princes of, they fought with the Lutheran princes, and that's because they wanted to limit the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. So religion isn't, again, the main thing here. It's something that starts off the conflict, very much like we saw with the Crusades, but it's not the be-all, end-all. It's not what everyone's focusing on. Eventually it becomes a political, economic fight that will whittle down to allowing princes to choose what they want for their people, but also giving concessions and giving new lands to different territories or different kingdoms. So those are the major wars that come out of it. Oh, and I forgot to bring up the 30 Years' War is pretty devastating. Some people put the estimates as low as 3 million, but it's usually estimated to be much higher than that, upwards of 11.5 million, which is, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I want to say it's a huge chunk of the population, like a third to half the population of Germany is devastated by this because all the fighting happens within that region. So you get these conflicts, but as well you get some good things that come out of it, like the church reforms. The Catholic Church actually reforms, and so they try to limit corruption. They do censor books, so they take out books that they don't agree with or that don't go with them and their ideas. But they also will push for better education for priests, and they'll get a Jesuit order, which is going to emphasize education, but also emphasize missionary work, which will try to bring people back to Catholicism. Now, going and converting Europeans back to Catholicism isn't going to work out very well, but converting new peoples to Catholicism is going to be really what they specialize in. And if you know in the 1500s what's happened at this point, just before here, Columbus has sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and now people are going to be starting to settle the Americas, and they're going to want to convert those native peoples to Christianity, and these Jesuits are going to be the guys that really push that. Now, on a more negative side with things, there's also the Inquisitions that come out of this to try to make sure that things are censored and people are following in line with what the Catholic Church or the Catholic regions want the people to think. But it's also, you might not call them Inquisitions, but these kinds of things happen in other regions of Europe, so everyone becomes very suspicious of each other, and you get more accusations of witchcraft. You also get just more accusations of heresy and stuff like that, especially if you didn't like someone that was your neighbor, you wanted to take your neighbor's land over, you might accuse them of something like that and cause them a lot of trouble. Sorry for the announcement here.
Just a reminder, we're starting right at 8 o'clock in the presentation room. Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption on the intercom there, but we're almost done here. This is the last little bit here, so we'll leave that in there. And so one of the greatest examples of the Inquisitions is the Spanish Inquisition, which kicks the non-Catholics out of Spain, and so that's going to be kicking Muslims, Jews, and any Protestants out, as well as it's going to lead to the imprisonment or death of people that are heretics that don't leave. And this is true of anywhere that the Inquisition is going on, that they're going to try to kick those people out or kill them, and so people get burned at the stake if they're accused of witchcraft or heresy. They might be put under house arrest if you're Galileo, who proved that the solar system was heliocentric, meaning that the sun was in the center of the solar system. He wasn't the first one to say that, but the church was pushing against that. But then when he used the telescope to observe what's going on and said, I'm pretty sure that's what's going on, the church said, nah, you got to be wrong there, and they put him under house arrest instead of killing him because he recanted a little bit, which means he took back his words a little bit or made it less strong of what he was saying. But that's kind of in a nutshell what we see happening for this. So some good things in that the churches get better and treat people better and do what they're supposed to do, and then there's some negative things of increased conflict and divisions between people.